I'm Sam McKagan, and I will be, can you hear me? No? Okay, how about that? Yes, okay. I'll be giving the Devar Torah today. And this week's Torah portion is not an easy one to talk about, and I had to do a lot of research to make sense of this. The Torah portion this week describes in painstaking detail the garments and accessories of the high priest, which fabrics, metals, and jewels these garments should be made from, and the rituals of animal sacrifice that the high priest performs while wearing these garments and accessories. So this is the kind of Torah portion that our rabbi would normally just skip over the literal meaning of, and jump straight into the symbolic, Kabbalistic meaning of what each of these details symbolizes about our higher consciousness. So he sent me, some articles about all this Kabbalistic meaning, and I have to admit that when I tried to read about the Kabbalistic symbolism behind each of the colors and jewels on each garment, that my eyes started to glaze over. And I tried about 5 times, but I couldn't get through it. So I won't be talking about that. So when I read this portion, the thing I actually really wanted to understand was not the higher symbolic meaning, but the literal meaning. Because the literal meaning of this passage feels completely alien to us now. Because thankfully, we no longer have high priests and animal sacrifice, so this is not actually describing really anything that we do. This passage speaks of an ancient time when the practices of Judaism were completely unlike anything that we recognize as Judaism today. And just to be clear, I don't mean that these practices are unlike the particularly unconventional form of Judaism that we have here at Beit Alef. I mean that it doesn't feel like it has much to do with any form of Judaism. But these practices must have meant a lot to our ancestors once upon a time if they were important enough to record in such painstaking detail and to preserve in our most sacred text for all these years. So what I wanted to understand about this passage was the context behind these practices and what they meant to the people at that time, and what remembering them might mean for us today, even though we no longer practice them. And even though I've read this passage and passages like it many times, I feel like I had never really understood it before and what it meant. This passage is a strange mix of mythology and history. So here at Beit Alef, our rabbi likes to say that the Torah is historical fiction and the rest of the Bible is fictionized history. So the story of Exodus, in which this passage is situated, probably never happened. There's very little historical evidence that the Jews were ever in Egypt, much less fled Egypt and lived in the desert for 40 years, wandered the desert for 40 years. We don't read these stories because they tell the actual history of our people, but because they tell us the deep mythology of who we understand ourselves to be and our relationship to God. However, the later stories of the Bible tell us about the times of the temple, which really existed, and of a history whose broad outlines can be corroborated by extra biblical sources. This story is a little strange in that it contains both history and mythology. So what's literally being described here is the garments worn by and the rituals performed by the priests of the temple in Jerusalem, a central place of Jewish worship, which existed from approximately 950 BC to 70 CE, with there being a destruction and rebuilding in there as well, but for roughly 1,000 years. And this text was probably written during the time of the temple, and it probably contains a reasonably accurate description of the practices of that time. But that's not actually how it's treated in the text. So the text never mentions the temple, and it describes these practices as if they started several hundred years before it was built, while the Israelites were still wandering in the desert. So the historical description of the practices of the temple are set within a mythological context. And that mythological context is a bit strange. So So what's happening leading up to this passage is that the Israelites have just escaped from Egypt. They've been wandering in the desert for about 3 months, and they've almost died several times, and they're not having a great time. So then they get to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up the mountain. He comes back down with the 10 Commandments, a whole bunch of really, really detailed laws about every aspect of life, and these detailed instructions for creating a mishkan, which is usually translated as tabernacle, and it's a giant portable tent that you're supposed to carry around in the desert and perform rituals in. So basically God is telling them, right now, while you're in the desert, before you go any further, you need to follow this incredibly detailed blueprint and build this giant tent filled with large ritual objects made of lots of gold and jewels. Also, you need to make these ritual garments for the priests made of the finest fabrics and special and precious stones. There should be alternating bells and pomegranates on the bottom of the priest's robe, and there's a giant golden headpiece. And then the priest needs to perform a whole bunch of complex daily rituals, and you need to haul this whole thing around in the desert for 40 years. And one of the things that struck me reading this passage was how they would describe the weight of each thing. And I didn't do the unit conversion, so I don't actually know, but the impression that you get is it's all very heavy. It's this giant gold thing and some other giant gold thing, and yeah, so I don't know all the rituals and all the symbolic things, but I definitely got the sense that all these things are big and complicated and heavy. So in spite of having read these passages many times, I had somehow never realized how strange the story was until putting it all together. So, one obvious question about all this is where did they get all these gold and jewels when they're wandering in the desert? But the Torah actually answers this question quite clearly. So if you go back a couple Torah portions, as they were preparing to leave Egypt, so right after packing up their unfermented dough, but before the plague of the death of the firstborn, there's a passage where it says that the children of Israel asked of the Egyptians objects of silver and objects of gold and clothing, and God gave the people favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and they let themselves be asked of. So basically God did a Jedi mind trick on the Egyptians and convinced them to give the Israelites all their gold and jewels before they left. So they've just got all these gold and jewels and clothing, so that's handy. So the Hebrew word for this portable tent is mishkan, which literally means dwelling place of the Shekinah, the dwelling place of God. This is where God comes to dwell and you meet God. So I find it kind of amazing that the dwelling place of God was built from materials stolen from our oppressors. Not only that, but right after these instructions are given, the Israelites do a very bad job of following them, and instead of building the Mishkan, they build the golden calf out of those same golden jewels. So then they realize their mistake, and they melt it down, and then they actually follow the instructions and build the Mishkan. So what this is saying is our holiest place is built from the remnants of our oppression and our mistakes. And I think that actually feels like a lesson that still makes sense today, that we create the greatest holiness in the most unlikely of places from the kind of things that don't always have the greatest histories. So the practices described in this passage really happened, but probably not at the time they are described. So it seems implausible to imagine that we really constructed all these things while wandering in the desert, even if we did have all the Egyptians' golden clothes and we hauled them around for 40 years. But there are deep connections between the Mishkan and the temple. So the dimensions and the description of the Mishkan perfectly match the inner chamber of the temple as it actually existed. There's this detailed blueprint, and it's just the way the inner chamber of the temple was. So those who interpret these stories literally believe that the Mishkan was built first, and so then, of course, the temple was modeled after it. But it's more likely that it was the other way around, that the Mishkan never existed, and the story was written during the time of the temple to project authority backward in time for their current practices, because if you can say these came from the time of Moses, then it gives them more authority. So the history of the temple, and the temple is still something that's very alien and hard to understand for us because we don't have anything like that today. So when I studied the history of Judaism, I learned that there was a dramatic break in the heart of Judaism in the year 70 CE when the second temple was destroyed and much of Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Jews were expelled. So before that, Judaism was a religion that was very much centered around the temple. So this was the place where God dwelled and where you needed to go to perform specific rituals under the guidance of priests in order to connect with God. And so it was so central that it was difficult to imagine a religion that Judaism, as it was at the time, you couldn't even imagine it without the temple. So when everything that we thought was central to our religion was destroyed, we had to reinvent ourselves and our religion. And so this is when Rabbinic Judaism began, which was practically a new religion because it was not centered around a particular place, but around studying our sacred texts and practices in the home. So it was a religion that we could take with us wherever we went. And so it's not just that we have new names for things. Rabbis are not replacement for priests, and synagogues are not replacements for the temple. It became a different thing. It became something that wasn't centered in this place anymore, but inside of us. So it's been said that the home is the new temple, because now our practices are so rooted in the home. So the kitchen table is the new altar. Our eating utensils are the new sacred vessels. Abraham Joshua Heschel, in his book, The Sabbath, talks about how instead of creating a sacred place for God to dwell now, we create a sacred time for God to dwell, which is Shabbat. We have, instead of creating temples in space, we now create temples in time. And Judaism is unlike a lot of religions in that way, that there is much less of a sense of a sacred place than a sacred time. So no matter how many times we're expelled and forced to wander, we can always create these temples anywhere and everywhere, every week in our own homes. We've moved beyond a religion that requires a ritual performed in a specific place to one where any of us can invite God to dwell in our own homes. And aside from a few ultra-Orthodox sects who are still studying the temple rituals in preparation for its rebuilding, most of us don't really want to go back. So why do we still read these passages describing in detail the details of rituals we no longer perform in places that no longer exist? What do they tell us about where we came from? And what do they tell us about who we are now? At the time the story was written, many of the people around us had their own temples to their own gods. Our temple was not so different from all those other temples. Our practices were really continuous with the practices of others at the time. And these rituals were similar to rituals that many other people carried out in their own temples. But there were some elements that were different. There were things that distinguished us. And so instead of seeing our God as one among many, we saw our God, first we saw him as just the best God, better than all the rest, and then eventually as the one God. And even in the Torah, in the passages about the making of the Mishkan, our first temple in space, are interspersed with passages about making Shabbat. And they use the same word, the same Hebrew word for make, for both things, to make the temple. And it would have made more sense to say build the temple, or the Mishkan, but they use the same word about making the temple and making Shabbat, the temple in time. So even then, we were already creating both rituals in space and rituals in time. And even in temple times, when our ritual was centered on a very particular place, we were already projecting those temple rituals backward into a time when we were a wandering people with no home. So we already had this vision of us as a wandering people that could practice anywhere, even before it was destroyed. So the idea of the temple as a temporary structure that we could carry with us in our hearts was already with us. And in addition to carrying forward the idea of a temple in time and in the home, we have carried forward the schedule of temple rituals, which is still reflected in the schedule of daily prayers. for observant Jews. So we've moved beyond the rituals described in this passage, but we still carry the essence contained within them in our hearts and daily practices. So these descriptions of these rituals are a bridge between the place we came from and all of the people around us that were performing these similar rituals and what we've created Judaism to be today, which now looks very different. But you see the progression and the continuity, some sense of continuity between them, but also certain senses of sharp breaks where things really shifted and had new meaning. So I'll end by sharing one story about an actual detail of a thing that the priest wears. There's a story I've heard Rabbi Olivier tell about this one accessory worn by the high priest that's described in this passage. So the priest wears this giant turban, and on the front is a big plate of gold. I don't know how much it weighed, but it seemed like it was really heavy. And on the plate of gold are inscribed the words, "Holy to God." So usually this is interpreted as a reminder that the priest himself is holy to God. But this interpretation misses one key detail, which is that the words are described in the Torah as engraved like a signet. So a signet is a seal usually set in a ring, and it's used to stamp your signature or your seal onto documents. So in order for a stamp to work, the engraving must be the mirror image of the thing that it's supposed to be stamped. So the words on the priest's headpiece, they're engraved as mirror images, is what this is saying. So it can't be for you to look at the priest and be reminded that he's holy to God. So another interpretation is that it's there so that when the sunlight reflects against this gold, it projects the words in front of him, then projected reading the right direction. And so it's a reminder to the priest as he walks that everything in front of him is holy to God. And so wherever he walks, he's reminded of that. Also in the Torah, there's another passage that says we are a nation of priests. And so another way to think about this is that we are all priests, and this is describing us and our practices. So if we are all priests, what would it mean for each of us to walk through the world being reminded in every moment that everything we see is holy to God?